important to look up on these specific differences and not on the similarities again, because what point is now, what is today. Another, this phrase, some people asking about it, what's going on, we forgot you. It's so a huge example for me. I've heard it really in this sentence against left demonstrators against globalization. So it was 20 years ago, I don't know. And so it can be seems so much, and so for me it becomes not any proof for anything, because the man who said it, I hear it clearly, was to another one with long hairs and rasta hairs, and a left one guy. So, and it was in Bavaria. Oh, what's going on? It helps nothing. I think so. I'm sorry. In this context, you can't imagine. And the question from Cosmina shows it well, that perhaps it is not really understanding very well what you want to say with this.
Ursula, a quick question.
Well, I would like to just quickly respond to this, that I consider the sentence very, very heavy, and that this Nazi concept, even in this shorthand, is used to be absolutely shocking. I also want to say that very often when I'm invited to talk to Holocaust survivors or their descendants, there was an assumption that the fourth generation now are completely different. And I almost from your talk find out the reverse. Because when I left Germany in '65, the word Jew was not pronounced. When I came back from spending a year in Israel, a colleague wanted to know whether I was Jewish, and he's like squirming around, and he's using the word mosaic face, and I pretended I didn't understand, and finally he forced himself with a red face to utter the word Jew.
Thank you. Okay. So
Okay. Comments. Thanks. I think just briefly to Ursula, I think there are so many more examples, but but I think my answer will probably relate to that, to my answer to Susanne. You know, it depends. I think I'm not working with the concept of proving in that sense, if I understand you right. I'm more interested in the context, subtleness, use of such language. Where does it come from? How does it travel? And as I said, well, yes, there is much more to say, and there are maybe even better examples, possibly. But briefly about what you said about the racisms disappear, that was just my initial remark. This didn't refer to Germany at all. I just, if this is what you mean, I just referred in the beginning to that. I found this quite interesting, that we talk about anti-Semitism in other minorities, for instance, just as also, for me, for anyone, and apparently not about anti-Semitism and racism, but that's more an interesting note to self. And okay, so as for the differences and focusing on the difference, my plan and for this conference, this was it was planned like this, that a talk on anti-Semitism and racism is part of it. And I think, what can I say? As I pointed out already, I focused for many years on the differences, and I think I see where you're coming from, that you say, and why do we have to focus again or more on the similarities? I think we have to, in that sense, that there is, in my view, there is a gap that is widening incredibly, that only the people who are actually running around with wild anti-Semitic conspiracies, or such as in the anti-global movement, etc., are the only ones talking about racism. This is why you would say, I guess also, why on earth do we have to talk about similarities? And on the other hand, we have discussions about anti-Semitism where similarities disappear entirely and it is only focused on the difference and the specificity, which I think is right, but I think at the same time, and that's the reason why I thought I want to, actually working on anti-Semitism, I want to bring this together again, because I do think it is incredibly important. Also, if you want to actually really discredit ideas or movements that keep stealing away the racism, so to speak, as accusation. I just think it is very important that there are similarities. But as I said, I don't want to engage in this competitive idea, what's more.
That note, we'll reconvene at, say, 3:10. We'll take a small break. Okay, so thank you both very much for really good papers. Josh, Clemens, and Cosmina are going to present. Josh will be first, and he is speaking about Israel bashing and anti-Semitism. Josh has a doctorate degree from the University of Chicago and worked mainly as a cultural anthropologist, but was also trained interdisciplinarily. He also has a DEA in International Law from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. He's conducted research on issues of human rights in Israel-Palestine and is engaged in a research project in the Durban Review Process and Conference. And he'll attend the conference, which is to be held later this month. Mr. Kaplan.
Thank you.
Doctor.
Thank you, Doctor. Yes, in fact, I'm leaving tomorrow for research on the Durban conference. And a few preliminary remarks about this paper. It is not in my area of expertise, and it's not the result of extended research, nor is it really anthropology. Can you hear me back there? What I'm interested in this presentation is in lines of thinking and argument that are in play, particularly in the United States, around the issue of anti-Semitism, particularly the relationship between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel and Israel bashing. So the first section of the paper is, I've called loosely, how anti-Semitism appears as a non-problem. This paper is about the relationship between anti-Semitism, criticism of Israel, and Israel bashing, as I said. This topic necessarily requires engagement with one of the most challenging intellectual and ethical problems surrounding the question of anti-Semitism today. At what point does criticism of Israel become anti-Semitism? But before I tackle that minefield, I want to mention a series of points that, taken together, make it difficult to recognize anti-Semitism as a significant problem today. That is, in the years since the outbreak of the Second Intifada, precisely in those circles where such recognition is perhaps most needed, the human rights community and the critically oriented academic community. In the first part of the paper, I briefly address 5 of these factors. Governmental data collection on anti-Semitism, a pervasive sense, particularly among left critical and human rights circles, that anti-Semitism is an effect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the treatment of Israel at the UN and by human rights organizations, media frames, and the role of Jewish NGOs and voices. In the second part of the paper, I attempt to tackle this gray area between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, or Israel bashing. My aim here is not to provide a new formula for making such distinctions. I assume that both legitimate and anti-Semitic criticism of Israel exist, and that there is a distinction. I simply want to begin to untangle some of the more difficult threads in the debate, including how some of the more influential attempts to deal with the distinction between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel once again may play into the prevailing perception that anti-Semitism is not a serious problem. So first, data collection. In its report on anti-Semitism in Europe, Human Rights First, the only major human rights NGO to seriously examine the issue, asserts that despite the, quote, extraordinary violence against Jews in the years following the outbreak of the First Intifada, quote, the argument that anti-Semitism is in some way an inevitable side effect of the Middle East conflict has been seized upon by European governments to justify not outrage, but inaction. As a result, claims Human Rights First, anti-Semitism has been largely absent from the anti-racism agendas of European countries, and data collection on the matter skews towards underreporting. Human Rights First is not the only agency that says this. There are other monitoring agencies that come to similar conclusions, but not human rights monitoring agencies in particular. Data collection practices are inconsistent across countries that report statistics on anti-Semitic incidents and sentiment, and many do not keep specific records at all. Part of the explanation for this may be the lack of a consistent definition. But poor record keeping may also indicate that many countries have yet to consider anti-Semitism a problem of sufficient seriousness to merit reporting and data collection in the first place. In those countries where no system in place to collect data, where there is no system in place to collect data on the subject, Jewish organizations have often stepped in to do so. I will return to that point in a moment. The same sort of thinking frequently appears in critical left academic circles. In a meeting last month with the former president of a major disciplinary association, I was told that the real issue with anti-Semitism is how it is used to deflect criticism from Israel's human rights record. This view, famously espoused by Judith Butler, has become widespread among academics and activists. The complaint that anti-Semitism can shut down debate or distract from legitimate criticism is repeated so often as to become a sort of mantra, particularly on the academic left, which, it must be said, is a sizable portion of academia. The notion that anti-Semitism can be used as a sort of trump card to assign, to use Butler's term, uninhabitable identifications, such as Jewish anti-Semite, has also become a reflex assumption. I believe that all of these sometimes occur, but what commentators like Butler miss, and she has contributed much to this position, is that sometimes, and in some places, far more places than Butler seems to imagine, it is rather the reflex assumption that anti-Semitism is a way of silencing criticism of Israel that makes it very difficult to take anti-Semitism seriously. By the way, when I'm talking about anti-Semitism in this paper, I'm always talking about contemporary anti-Semitism, and particularly in the last few years, since the outbreak of the Second Intifada. Perhaps we could go back a little farther, but that's really the period I'm talking about. Thus, there is a strong presumption in left academic circles that contemporary anti-Semitism is not a serious issue, as I said, that the real issue is the Palestinians and their rights, and anti-Semitism both distracts from that, and to the extent that it occurs, is an effect, quote unquote, that we can take care of by taking care of the conflict, or by stopping Israel's human rights violations. In other words, anti-Semitism is not an important human rights or critical intellectual issue because it is an effect of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, particularly of Israel's more objectionable policies and actions. In this line of thinking, to do contemporary scholarly work on the subject, and I stress not historical work, which is another matter and far less controversial, is to effectively give ammunition to Israel's supporters precisely at a moment when Israel's policies and actions are most controversial. Third, there is a strong presumption among human rights advocates and organizations that Israel is a gross and frequent violator of human rights with a sophisticated team of international lawyers employed to justify the country's violations. The innumerable reports documenting Israeli human rights violations put out by the UN, I have statistics here, it's incredible. The US State Department calculated that nearly 170 negative resolutions were passed against Israel in the United Nations between 2001 and 2007. In the same period, the countries with the next most negative resolutions passed against them were Burma, with just over 10, the Sudan and the DPRK, with both under 10. And with specifically human rights issues, the proportions are similar, not quite as extreme. So as I was saying, the innumerable reports documenting Israeli human rights violations put out by the UN, international organizations, and even Israeli organizations, and Israel's apparently intractable response add to the presumption that if anti-Semitism exists, it is Israel's responsibility, not that of human rights organizations. Whatever the reasoning, the effect is clear. Reports on anti-Semitism as a human rights concern have been few. Reports on Israeli violations have been very many. This fact further supports the impression that Israel is a gross and frequent violator of human rights, and that anti-Semitism, once again, is not a significant human rights issue. As the State Department put it in its latest report on contemporary global anti-Semitism, put out late last year, the collective effect, I'm quoting now, the collective effect of unremitting criticism of Israel, coupled with a failure to pay attention to regimes that are demonstrably guilty of grave violations, has reinforced the notion that the Jewish state is one of the sources, if not the greatest source, of abuse of the rights of others, and thus, intentionally or not, encourages anti-Semitism. There is, of course, another way of looking at Israel's human rights record at the UN and among NGOs, that the content of the criticism is often deserved, but we will come to that later. For the moment, what matters is the effect. Israel appears as a big bully, and anti-Semitism, to the extent that it exists, to the extent that the data is collected, seems like the little person's response or part of it. Fourth, because governments, international organizations, and human rights NGOs have devoted little attention in documenting or denouncing the rise of anti-Semitic incidents around the world, and as just said, I'll come back to that idea of the rise of in a moment, including in democratic countries, it has fallen on Jewish organizations to collect data and call it the problem. This idea of the rise of anti-Semitism, pretty much most of the commentators on the new anti-Semitism and much of the sources of data collection show what seems to be a rise, particularly since the Second Intifada, but from year to year it's hard to trace this since the methods of data are inconsistent and often new modes of collection are invented from one year to the next, so it might seem like a spike, but in fact it's to do with better data collection methods. Anyway, it's safe to say that there's been a fair amount of anti-Semitic incidents in this period, leaving aside the definition of anti-Semitism and leaving aside the problem of inconsistent data collection. All of these sources are pointing to a significant number of incidents and a significant amount of anti-Semitic sentiment around the world. So the fact that it's fallen on Jewish organizations to collect data and cause a problem has a number of consequences. Because human rights organizations have come to be seen as neutral and legitimate, their lack of reporting on the subject underlines the presumption that anti-Semitism must not be an important issue, at least not an important human rights issue. Two main interpretations seem to follow from the impression that mostly Jewish voices speak out on anti-Semitism. First, because anti-Semitism appears to be so obviously tied to the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Jewish voices speaking on the issue seem to be just one side in an ongoing conflict that has taken on international dimensions, Israel's side. Second, to the extent that observers consider anti-Semitism to be an issue in its own right, it seems to be an exclusively Jewish issue, as opposed to, say, a universal one. Chatterley, who spoke at YIISA recently, makes this point about media frames, and here begins our fifth factor. When anti-Semitic incidents are reported in the media, the voice quoted as speaking in outrage is very often a representative of a Jewish organization or a well-known Jew, thus creating the impression that anti-Semitism is a Jewish problem and not, for example, a human rights problem, or anyway, not the concern of human rights organizations. Moreover, the media frame for understanding human rights issues is, generally speaking, one side perpetrator, the other side victim, one violator, one violated. If Israel is a gross and frequent human rights violator and Israel is a Jewish state, then it is difficult to fit violations of Jewish rights into this frame. There's a lot more to say about how human rights issues are covered and the presuppositions of human rights organizations, and I've studied this kind of thing, but that I think will suffice to make my point. We don't have a lot of time. So anyway, reframing this inherent impossibility of seriously considering at the same time both anti-Semitism and violation of Palestinian rights is one of the motivations for this paper. Okay, now we're on the second part. Drawing the line between legitimate criticism and Israel bashing. So we now have a beginning sense of why anti-Semitism is so often not taken to be a serious issue. But we have not yet entered into the more challenging discussion of how to define anti-Semitism, and at what point criticism of Israel might become anti-Semitic or mask anti-Semitic sentiment. In a move to counter the prevailing assumption that anti-Semitism is an effect of the conflict, many reports on anti-Semitism and attempts to define and combat it have taken an ethical stand. The Israel-Palestine conflict can never serve as a justification for anti-Semitic acts. Let's look at one of the bolder formulations often repeated in international circles dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism, the so-called Berlin Declaration. And I quote, "We participants declare unambiguously that international developments or political issues, including those in Israel or elsewhere in the Middle East, never justify anti-Semitism." It is difficult to disagree with this statement on ethical grounds. It is, of course, never justified to use the Israel-Palestine conflict as an excuse, much less a justification for anti-Semitic acts or sentiment. Just like the United States' actions in the Middle East cannot be a justification for suicide bombing against American civilians. But to assert that the conflict cannot serve as a justification is not very helpful for understanding why the view that anti-Semitism is an effect of the conflict is so pervasive, nor how it is that attempts to combat anti-Semitism can, ironically, play into that understanding. Nor do such assertions help very much in drawing the highly controversial line between criticism and anti-Semitism. Now, of course, when I say the highly controversial line, there are clear cases. I'm not talking about the clear case in this particular point in my paper. There are two basic types of arguments about when criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitism, and neither is concerned with the intention of the speaker, actor, or claims maker. The first type points to the manner of expression of the claim, or the degree of hostility implied in the terms employed. Jewish Nazis, or calling the Israeli state a little Satan, and so on. The other type of argument points to a cumulative effect amounting to or facilitating anti-Semitism. The cumulative effect, for example, of the number and frequency of complaints about Israel and the UN, the NGOs, the media, is that Israel is singled out for what one commentator in a recent discussion on the boycott campaign in the New York Times called unique bile, and therefore appeals as once again, a gross and frequent human rights violator, perhaps the worst such violator. The fact that most serious violators of human rights are not subject to the same degree of criticism, in fact, we could reasonably say that none currently are, is thought to be a double standard. Moreover, when such an image of Israel is widespread, and it arguably is, the road is paved for acts that are anti-Semitic in their own right. The best known attempts to draw a line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism are probably Sharansky's 3 Ds, delegitimization, double standards, and demonization, and the EUMC definition, which I'm not going to get into. I want to look critically at 2 of these, if I have time. I don't know how do I have time. I'm going to look critically at one of these. The issue of double standards. In a longer version of this paper, I also look at the issue of delegitimization of Israel's right to exist. That's what delegitimization generally means. As I said, singling Israel out for criticism is thought to be a double standard. With the possible exception of the United States, no other country is currently subjected to such criticism from so many sources. We must admit at once that singling out is not only a result of anti-Semitism, however, even if it is likely to contribute to it. Global interest in the Israel-Palestine conflict for religious, strategic, and journalistic reasons contributes to the ongoing focus. Comparative ease of access for journalists and for human rights field workers is another factor. Nor should we discount the self-critical style of many Jews, including many Israeli Jews. These factors at least partly explain the amount of criticism directed at Israel, though it must be said that the degree of hostility is often out of proportion to the policies and actions supposedly criticized. Further, the singling out as anti-Semitism argument is vulnerable to at least 2 objections. First, it does in fact brush aside potentially legitimate criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, at least in cumulative effect, because the argument is precisely this. In cumulative effect, criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. So we can come back to this. This feeds once again into the presumption that arguments about anti-Semitism are a way of deflecting criticism of Israel. Second, individual critics of Israel may well have a point, at least sometimes, and quickly jumping to the conclusion that a large international public outcry is anti-Semitic or feeds anti-Semitism, the substance of individual criticisms may not be taken seriously. This can further the impression that anti-Semitism is used to distract from discussions of Palestinian rights. Moreover, the very timing of claims making about anti-Semitism can make it appear to be bound up with the Israel-Palestine conflict. Campaigns against the boycott of Israeli universities, against the threat of anti-Semitism in the Durban Review Conference, seem to reach a sort of height in the middle of the Gaza affair. So the flip side of the prevailing assumption that anti-Semitism is an effect of the conflict is that the number of voices speaking out about anti-Semitism at the height of the controversy over Israel's military actions can seem like an apparent justification for those actions. The fact that prominent commentators like ADL's Foxman explicitly link in the same public address a justification for Israel's actions with an outcry over anti-Semitism reinforces this sense. You can look on the website right now. There's a about 20-minute long clip from Foxman. First 10 minutes are all a defense of why what Israel did is completely without the justification for criticism. And then the outrage over anti-Semitism in the second half. Again, the fact that the number of voices on anti-Semitism seems to arise because of all the factors that I mentioned, mostly from Jewish sources, can appear to be a deliberate distraction from the Israel-Palestine conflict. Skipping stuff. To briefly conclude, some of the attempts to draw a sharp line between legitimate criticism of Israel and Israel bashing can run into these kind of, I don't know what you want to call them, gray areas where the kind of argument can be flipped around and could be seen to contribute to the very thing that it would be meant to combat. Of course, there are far more clear-cut cases we could have chosen, and it is critical to call those out when they occur. And they do occur, sometimes with remarkable ferocity. It is important to be clear. If by providing apparent legitimacy to the hostility directed at Israel and Jews present in many countries today, the phenomenon of singling out Israel contributes to supporting situations where, for example, genocidal anti-Semitism is rampant, we need to take that very seriously. Nevertheless, it is important also to consider how dismissive attitudes about anti-Semitism as a problem can ironically be supported by the way the debate is sometimes framed. And we can begin to see this by looking at some of these examples, other examples that I didn't talk about. Anyway, I want to say that both of the following are the case. That the cumulative effect of singling out Israel can contribute to the already significant level of hostility directed against Israel, especially in the context of potentially proliferating genocidal threats. But at the same time, the cumulative effect of dismissing it as anti-Semitism, coupled with the coincidental timing of those dismissals with some of Israel's more controversial policies and activities, can feed the presumption that anti-Semitism is an effect of the conflict. Effect again in quotes. And feeds the assumption that anti-Semitism is a trump card for Israel supporters. And to characterize that, no matter what you say, if everyone else is saying it, it amounts to anti-Semitism. So it is very difficult to keep both these positions in view at the same time, much less inhabit both of them. We might say that a discursive frame is developed which seems to make it almost impossible to be concerned about human rights, including Israel's possible violation of them, the very real dangers of anti-Semitic incidents around the world, and how the enormous human rights focus on Israel might contribute to such incidents. I would like to bring these 2 points of view into one analytic frame. Okay. And now this is just a very brief conclusion. Nothing I've said should be interpreted as diminishing the critical nature of the problem of anti-Semitism today, nor the various factors which converge to make it difficult to see and take seriously by the very players who could play a critical role in combating it. But it is important to consider that cumulative effect arguments about anti-Semitism can take 2 sides. If, on the one hand, we accept that various factors combine to make it seem as if anti-Semitism is not an important issue, and the extent to which it exists is an effect of the Israel-Palestine conflict, an epiphenomenon, we need also to accept that a similar sort of cumulative effect argument could be made about how Palestinian human rights are overshadowed in the debates about anti-Semitism. However, no one can seriously argue today that Palestinian human rights are not taken seriously as an issue, nor covered in the very 401 expects to cover human rights issues. Local and international mass media, international organizations, NGOs, even governments and their foreign policy. The argument that anti-Semitism is simply a smokescreen for Israel's human rights violations, while perhaps true in certain discursive instances, and true to more limited extent in cumulative effect, diminishes the apparent seriousness of anti-Semitic acts committed around the world, and contributes to the status quo ante of underreporting, underconcern, and leaving it to the Jews to talk about.
Okay, thank you. The next speaker is Clemens Heni. He's going to be speaking about Islamic anti-Semitism and the failure of Western academy or academia. Clemens has a PhD in political science. He studied philosophy, cultural studies, and political science at Tübingen, Brenham, FU University is the Free University in Berlin, as well as the University in Innsbruck. He's published 2 books, including chapters on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, Nature, Conservation and Anti-Semitism in Germany, Catholicism and Anti-Semitism, and Notions of Secondary Anti-Semitism. He's contributed and spoken in conferences internationally since 2002. He's written in the Jerusalem Post, the Jewish Political Studies Review, and other journals and newspapers and magazines internationally, and has recently started to speak around Connecticut on issues of anti-Semitism. So, Clemens.
Yeah, thank you. First, I have to say something about my cat, because I mean the Yankees. Not all people like the Yankees in Connecticut, I know, but coming from Europe is something special to be a Yankee. I mean, it's not just the Yankees as a kind of sports event or sports team, but it's a kind of being American or whatever. And in Germany or in Europe, even in other parts of Latin America, of course, if you say Yankee, all people say Yankee go home, and there are books written about that and songs. And so, being a Yankee, especially as I was taught and coached by Andy Markowitz, who has written extensively about anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism, and he was my advisor, my PhD. So it's a kind of, and he's also a fan of the Yankees. So it's kind of important to have such a nice hat. I would like to begin with a picture. I go online. Is this possible? Maybe I take it different because I have it because it's an important picture actually. I can show it to you because you are not thousands of people attending. I can show you in my own machine because it's very interesting. It's the homepage of Hezbollah. It's Hezbollah TV, Hezbollah.tv, caricature.php. And I can show you because it's just as a kind of some of those people. You see a cartoon, a Star of David, and a person marching with a sword.
You can connect with computer.
I don't know. I don't think so.
We can look at the picture.
Why not?
Okay.
It will be easier.
Yeah, maybe if it does, all of goes down for my 20 minutes, but
The time of the clock is stopped.
yes. Okay, like an ice hockey. Like football.
The Yankees get more time.
Kind of no surprise. That's Hezbollah. You see all those cartoons, most of them well known probably. But I would like
Too fast.
No, the first one, that's my point, that's what's so funny. Because Hezbollah is a kind of terrorist organization, and the United States of America declared it's a kind of terrorist organization. And the first cartoon actually was printed in the New York Times last week on Wednesday. And the next day, it was the 27th of March, Hezbollah themselves, obviously they're reading the New York Times and they are happy about it, and they just took it. And I think that's a kind of really shocking event that an anti-Semitic cartoon printed not in his, from Hezbollah or in any Arab or Muslim journal or newspaper, but in the New York Times, goes immediately to the, in this case, Arab world, spreading Jew hatred. That's kind of really scaring. And so that's the kind of political culture of the United States of today, because New York Times is not just a local journal, as you know. So that's just a starter, and the second starter, if it works, will be a short video going from New York City to Berlin, also capital of a Western country, the capital of Germany. There took place some rallies, and during the war in Gaza, and I just tried to get one of those videos. It's just 7 seconds actually, and yeah.
You're not connected to this.
Okay, so it doesn't work. Anyway, it is a kind of video where there is said, you can see it, death to Israel, Tod Israel, tötet Juden, kill the Jews, or very interesting, Jude, Judifying Schwein, it means Jew, coward of a pig. That's extremely scary. Okay, so I close this and just, I wanted to show this video because that's really something, and I've been living in Berlin the last 5 years, and this is definitely a new development in the city of Berlin. That you have at least 3 times between 5 and 10,000 Muslims. Is it a little close or? It should close actually. Because my laptop is closed. I don't know what. You can disconnect. You can disconnect because I don't need it anymore. The video is not working. It's no problem. So I go to the analysis of this video later on because I can't show it. In this short, very short presentation, I want to shine a tiny spotlight on Islamic anti-Semitism, which I believe is the most dangerous phenomenon of our times. As a supporter of the ADL, I got a letter yesterday, and the words of Abby Foxman are very sad, urging the world for action against anti-Semitism. Foxman survived the Holocaust and couldn't imagine decades ago, as he told us last year at the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism in Jerusalem, that there would be ever another situation like today, with the nastiest anti-Jewish rallies all over the world. And also yesterday, Yossi Halevi gave a very impressive and important lecture at YIISA, declaring that today the fight against Islamic jihad is most important. So I would like to give you some impact, what is Islamic jihad and what is Islamic anti-Semitism. I already mentioned this rally in Berlin. I just skipped this because this is just a proof of what the Muslims in Berlin are just doing today. I go on to the United States. President Obama gave most recently a video address, you can see it also on YouTube, to Iran on the Nafris New Year, without accusing Iran of denying the Holocaust
It's very subtle.
Good, okay. Okay, President Obama, so this video we also cannot see because now there's no screen anymore, but anyway, Obama gave an address to Iran, very friendly words and lovely, without accusing Iran of denying the Holocaust or making conferences a la a world without Zionism. He pleaded for good relations amongst civilizations, quote. In what sense Iran under the Mullah since 1979 is still civilized? This is a question Obama does not raise. The response on the other side of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was very prompt and interesting because they have internet in Iran and they listen to YouTube. It was also delivered as a private note from Obama to the government. So this Ali Khamenei was saying, I quote, "My advice to the American officials, to the president and to the others, is to think carefully about these things. Give all your advices to someone to translate it for you, but don't give it to the Zionists to translate. I mean, what he's saying, Heni in Farsi, he urged us not to give it to the Zionists. Okay, we can decode the anti-Semitism of that speech if we look at the word Zionists. Khamenei imagines that those people working in radio stations, at TV channels, and the press, those who will translate his Farsi speech into English, German, Spanish, or French, are all Zionists. He imagines a world conspiracy, cheated media, and all translators are run by the Jews. Red Zionists. American writer and Iranian-born Amil Imani last week urged President Obama to be less naive about the attempt of the US administration to discuss with the Iranian regime. Imani urges the American president not to betray the Iranian people another time. The first time was 1979. Quote, President Obama said the United States wants the Islamic Republic of Iran to take its rightful place in the community of nations, quote end. But, Mr. President, the Iranian nation does not wish to be associated with this occupying regime whatsoever. In fact, they want the Islamic Republic to be thrown into the dustbin of history as quickly as possible. Mr. President, today the Islamic Republic of Iran is one of the greatest threats to the stability of the civilized world and humanity at large. It continues to impose its horrendous ideology on the Iranian population, quote end. Another scholar, Philip Carl Saltzman, professor of anthropology at McGill University, Canada, is critical about the Obama attempt to engage, you know, engagement is a new word, with regimes like Iran. Saltzman says, quote, the president's emphasis on the commonalities of Americans and Iranians reflects the major cultural frame of progressive American culture, a frame which emphasizes and celebrates diversity and inclusion. In this frame, Iranians and Americans should be able to get along just the way Iranian Americans get along with Spanish, Jewish, African, Italian, and other hyphenated Americans. We are all human, the president seems to say, and we all want the same things, which, if we work together, we can all gain. This is another assumption of the progressive American frame. All can be winners. There needs no be losers. Life is not a zero-sum game. And if we are all winners, we can all be equal, a third element of that frame. So this is a crucial statement, that's the reason why I quoted it, and especially Saltzman, who has been working in the field of anthropology and the Middle East for decades, I think he's really aware of what Obama is doing, and Obama is just missing the point how to deal with jihadists or just another culture which does not want to be engaged. In 1979, Khomeini, the old Khomeini, he was living outside Paris and never visited Paris. I mean, a person who is not willing to visit Paris, I mean, the capital of the 19th century, I mean, that's kind of strange. But okay. Next paragraph is the biggest threat of the 21st century so far, Islamic Jihad. On September 11, 2001, the Islamist movement declared war against the United States, the West, and the Jews by killing 3,000 people by flying hijacked aircrafts into the Twin Towers of World Trade Center and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Literally, they declared war even before, and the Arab world is at war with Israel since 1948. But 9/11 is the murderous symbol of that ongoing war of Islamic Jihad against the West. The nuclear ambitions of Iran clearly show the realistic threat, which derives of Islamic anti-Semitism. Worse, the statement was backed by a Holocaust denial conference in Tehran in 2006. The collaboration with neo-Nazis and European or Western Holocaust deniers of the above-mentioned conference in Iran underlines the radical and dangerous outline of today's Iran. Now I go, because of the time, just back to the 7th century, Islamic anti-Semitism and the Quran. The Quran has undoubtedly several anti-Jewish surahs, like Jews have to be humiliated because they had to disbelieve the signs of God and slaying the prophets unrightfully, Surah 26158. The next one is, O believers, take not Jews and Christians as friends. They are friends with each other. Whose of you makes them his friends is one of them. God guides not the people of the evildoers. This is Surah 551. And the third one is, for example, Surah 265. And well, you know, there were those among you that transgressed the Sabbath, and we said to them, be you apes miserably slinking. I cannot go into details of the emergence of Islam, but one central aspect has to be mentioned. Some scholars have criticized the attempt to define the relationship of Muslims and Jews as somehow golden time, especially compared with Christianity. Professor Ronald L. Nadler published for the Whittle Sassoon Center already in 1986 an important piece about Islam and anti-Semitism by criticizing that attempt, including a criticism of famous Bernard Lewis. Professor Nadler says, quote, Muhammad's emigration, Hijra, to Medina marked the beginning of Islamic history. Islam's calendar started with the Hijra, because it was through Muhammad's enhanced role as a political leader in Medina that Islam first fulfilled its destiny as a polity. It was as though Islam had not yet fully existed in Mecca, where the nascent ideal Ummah political community could never have been realized. Muslims' view immersion from Medina consequently reflected the worst possible attitudes towards the Jews. Islam's earlier ambivalence, desiring its own confirmation from the people of the Jewish book, while at the same time remaining condescending towards the same people and book, had here almost vanished. Now there was absolute confidence in Islam's superiority and finality, with the notion of the Jews and polytheists being the worst enemies of the believers. The element of contradiction and confrontation became paramount. The earlier possibility of accommodation had disappeared. Here, in the heat of bad relations, the foundation of continuing theological antipathy toward the Jews was irrevocably laid. Quote, end. My friend and colleague Neil Kressel, Professor Neil Kressel, is here, fellow at YIISA this academic year, wrote in 2007, in the early years of Islam, this book is here, it's Bad Faith, it's an important book. In the early years of Islam, quote, the Caliph Umar expelled the Jews from Khaybar and all Arabia, relying on a provision of the surrender that said that the terms could be revoked if the Muslims so desired. When Hezbollah named their missile Khaybar 1, therefore it portrayed its battle against Jews and Israel as a continuation of one started in Muhammad's day. The Palestinian Sunni militant organization Hamas similarly has employed the Khaybar name in its slogan, Khaybar, Khaybar, O Jews, Muhammad's army will return. Quote end. This foundation of Islam has to be kept in mind if we read about today's hatred of Islamist jihadists or prayers in mosques with Islamicist imams. So, now another interesting history dealing with a book published in 1898 in India, but coming from a German guy. Another story of the theological source, and it's interesting and fun, of Islam is of interest. In 1833, German Jewish Rabbi Abraham Geiger from Wiesbaden, one of the most important reform-oriented Jews of his time, published his PhD about Judaism and Islam. The core of his analysis is the assumption that Muhammad borrowed a lot of ideas from Islam from the Jews and Judaism. At the end of his study, he refers to several anti-Jewish quotes in the Quran, claiming that it was necessary for Muhammad to set some opposite rules or ideas in regard to Judaism to veil his borrowing from Jewish sources. Quote end. Not quote end, but that's the end of this story. There's of course a big debate about history of the Jews in Islam, to which I cannot refer here, but at least the concept of being dhimmi has to be mentioned, and it has been analyzed, for example, by Badior in 1980. Although the history of Christianity was even worse for the Jews than Islam, Islam was nonetheless a threat for the Jews. Jews were, for example, like Christians, not allowed to ride horses or camels. I have a footnote here, and this footnote is saying, for those people who want to compare the situation for Muslims or other minorities or groups in Muslim countries with the Jews in former times, just imagine a single country in the world today which is not allowing a Muslim, because of being a Muslim, to ride a bicycle or a car. Okay, the fact is that pogroms occurred in Muslim societies against Jews, like in Morocco's Fez in 1465, in Granada in 1066, and in other places. Muslim leaders introduced special insignia for Jews as early as 717, hundreds of years before Christianity. invented a kind of yellow star in 1215 in the unfamous Second Lateran Council. A crucial moment for the Islamic anti-Semitism of today was a conference in 1968 held at the Egyptian Al-Azhar Mosque and University, the so-called Yale of the Islamic world. It was the fourth conference of the Academy of Islamic Research. Islamic leaders and scholars from 24 countries produced a quasi-official position to Islam to the Jews, defining the Jews as the, quote, worst enemies of Islam, and, quote, the best friends of Satan. Avi Baker concludes, quote, this Al-Azhar document made the Jews not just the humiliated dhimmis of the past, but rather a challenge to the primacy of Islam, quote, end. My next point would have been the blood libel and the importance of blood libel until today. I just skipped this because it's too much, but it's important. Also, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. We heard a lot of this already from Charles and Idit, and yesterday also. Also, the Muslim Brotherhood and the invention of the deaf industry is really interesting. And my colleague Matthias Künzel wrote about the deaf industry, which is an article of Albana Kutukum later in 1938. And I would say we can compare this, for example, with the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who is probably the most quoted philosopher of the 20th century. His Vorlauf zum Tode is forerunning for death, but it's just too much to go into details right now. So my last point is the failure of Western academia in addressing the problem. Because the problem, as I tried to show, is a problem actually. It means Islamic antisemitism is really a very big problem. It's the biggest threat for Israel and the Jews, but also for the West and even for Muslims in all those Muslim countries. So what about the failure of Western academia? The fact that there have been very few conferences, if any, of scholars of Middle East studies on the topic of anti-Semitism on an academic level on universities, that would be a really empirical study. I dare if there have been at least one single conference of a specific Middle Eastern studies program on a North American university dealing with the topic. Maybe not even one conference, but I'm not sure. Anyway, there is an interesting study by Martin Kramer. You can look this online. He's saying in any way, in what ideological way they failed to just make it as a topic. That's really important. And Neil Kressel proved the same failure of psychologists and sociologists to address the topic of anti-Semitism adequately. The failure of post-colonial theory, anthropology, and especially those following Edward Said's theory of Orientalism from 1978 has just in recent years become more and more an issue in research through the mainstream, the mainstream in literature, sociology, anthropology, political science, and several other fields remain uncritical. But there is at least a study last year published on the problematic of post-colonial studies and anti-Semitism. Finally, what about the parallelization of anti-Semitism with, quote, Islamophobia? To equate anti-Semitism as a whole with racism or prejudice has become fashionable. The United Nations and the Muslim world, for them, Islamophobia is an important weapon to reject criticism of Islamic jihad. There's a good article of a colleague of mine from Berlin, Klaus Faber, who has written for the Jerusalem Post, and with some interesting quotes from Muslim leaders who use this very, how to say, fashionable, but also in a clever way to persuade the Western world that it's really a threat for them. Even in serious research centers, like the Berlin Center for Research on Anti-Semitism, headed by Professor Wolfgang Benz, which organized a conference on that equation in December 2008, Islamophobia has become an important part of their work. I criticized this conference in the Jerusalem Post, and since then there has been a big debate in both German and English-speaking blogs in the internet, as well in Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, Wall Street Journal. Benz and his colleagues declared that we know the stigmatization of Muslims of today from the history of anti-Semitism. Well, this is not true. Rather, it trivializes the history of anti-Semitism in an unprecedented way for an institute supposed to be critical about anti-Semitism. But in fact, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because if you look at the Western world in general, it's a failure, and it's called struggle of victimhood, which a term of Dina Porat, she used it last year also at this interesting and important conference in Jerusalem. So, because of lack of time, I have to keep some of things, well, York University was already mentioned this morning, and what is very important is, of course, Bernard-Henri Lévy. Bernard-Henri Lévy, one of the leading intellectuals of our times, a Frenchman, he wrote a book, Left in Dark Times, A Stand Against the New Barbarism. Lévy is engaged, he does not keep silent, and he attacks people by naming them, if necessary, to indicate the unbelievable failure of Western academia in general and the left in particular. Lévy is probably the loudest left European anti-fascist voice of today's world. He reminds us that anti-fascism was about National Socialism. Actually, I myself was one of the founders of some anti-fascist groups in Germany in the 1990s. So anti-fascism is an important term, even if some people do not know this, but in Western Europe it's an important term for those people who have been fighting against Nazi Germany and who are today fighting against Islamic Jihad. Bernard-Henri Lévy is creating the term Fash-Islamism, the Islamic version of fascism, and he recalls his intellectual and political development since the 1960s. Quote, "What I do know for sure is that we still had some reflexes, and when that hatred became visible to the naked eye in the organizations that embraced al-Husseini, when his legacy was embraced by people for whom he remained until his death and beyond, the true master thinker, when, in other words, commands from Fatah killed 11 Israeli athletes during the Munich Olympics 1972, a shiver of horror ran through everyone who had anything to do with the left." Even if this might be a little bit exaggerating, because I think a lot of left people have kept left and anti-Semitic, but anyway, he was not keeping on that kind of anti-Israeli left. And today, he's very worried about today, that today there's not the same impression, and there's a very good quote from him. And I'm thinking of a tiny event, almost ignored by the press, but immensely powerful, symbolically. A declaration by Cindy Sheehan, America's anti-war mother, the mother of all the mothers whose children have been killed in Iraq, and who had to be shown respect because the anti-Bush climate demanded it. I'm thinking of the terrible thing she said, which accused the Jewish state of the worst crime a state can be accused of. Quote, Cindy Sheehan, "My son joined the army to protect America, not Israel." Quote end. She had enough to these lies, these treasures. Quote, "which we mothers know we are all for the sole profit of Israel." Quote end. Jewish state, sacrificial idol, the innocent flesh of American children burned before the altar of Israel. Once again, it's all there. Quote end from Bernard-Henri Lévy. Professor Ruth Weiss wrote an important article most recently in Commentary, Forgetting Zion. Her article expresses her deep concern about the future of support for the Jewish state of Israel, especially in North America, where most Jews outside Israel are living. Quote, "A Jewish child growing up as I did in Montreal during the 1940s absorbed Zionism as naturally as Canadian ground did the snow in springtime." Quote end. She said that this is no longer the fact. Zionism has become an obstacle to become part of the establishment in the Western world, thanks to left-wing and Muslim anti-Semitism spread over the decades. A cultural relativism which denounces universalism also undermines the struggle against bigotry and Islamic anti-Semitism. People in academia, like at Yale, have enormous privileges. It is our duty to fight anti-Semitism and not to wait until it's too late. Absorbing Zionism and supporting Israel for a lot of different other reasons should be part of another summer of love. Radical Muslims like neither love nor sex and rock and roll, nor other core Western values like liberty and freedom. A time when the left, and not just the left, but all of us, may become lost in the dark winter of Islamic anti-Semitism and Islamic jihad may not be far off.
Thank you for a clear and well-researched paper. And now, the final paper of the day is Cosmina Paul. She's going to speak on new avenues on campus anti-Semitism. Cosmina is a PhD, well, first of all, she's a graduate fellow here at YIISA, and she's a PhD candidate in history at Babes Bollia University in Romania. She's writing a dissertation on anti-Semitism in the Romanian collective imagination in the 20th century, and has collaborated on research projects at the Institute of Oral History. She holds a BD in sociology and a master's in Jewish studies, and now her research is focusing on oral history interviews, sociological inquiries, and classical history analysis, which are centered on anti-Semitism and collective memory and Jewish heritage. And she's actually doing groundbreaking research on Romanian history and anti-Semitism in the aftermath of the Holocaust.
I will start my presentation on campus antisemitism with the pretext.
Yes.
And so I will start my presentation on campus antisemitism with a pretext. And not necessarily because I would need a pretext to address this topic or this specific concern, but during my presentation I will use different concrete examples to raise specific concerns and to support your understanding and to help to understand my concern. So the pretext would be that now 4 days ago took place, for those who are familiar with, BDA's days. This meaning that took place the Global Day of Action for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. And as you probably already know, figure out from the vocabulary, it was an anti-Israeli campaign. And parallel with this campaign, in the same day, both campaigns were meant to aim to hit the campus. So it took place a reply to this campaign, which was launched by Campus Outreach Division of Simon Wiesenthal Center. The campaign was entitled I Can campaign, and it is only for campus developed, and always try to respond to this. So let's have a closely look on this campaign. First of all, BDA's days, their text, their subtext, their language is very emblematic for this kind of anti-Israeli campaign which takes place on the campuses. The response of Simon Wiesenthal Center is not an emblematic one for the response in this climate of Jewish organization responding. As we already know that Simon Wiesenthal is not necessarily a representative figure for this Jewish responder. There are many Jewish organizations who can dismiss from this line. But I will go back to Simon Wiesenthal with raising another issue. And so I would like to make a remark about the first campaign, BDA's Days, which was meant to coincide, and this kind of campaign, which always meant to coincide with some other event, are very important in following this, what is going on campuses, and was meant to coincide with Palestinian Land Day, to the annual commemoration of 1976 of the Israeli massacre on Palestinian Galilee. And yes, so we can see, and you probably know, when there is Holocaust Memorial Day, there are organized specifically anti-Israeli campaign when there are Israeli Independence Day, we can also see this kind of overlapping. Okay, let's have an analysis, very shortly, analyze of the call for this campaign, which was meant to be developed in more than 40 campuses. So, this call for why I am raising this, because it just happened, and because it is very typical in the language and the vocabulary. And for me, this is very important. I will give you an insight on my approach. So, only one phrase I will quote. The time for the world to fully adopt and implement the Palestinian call for boycotts, divestments, and section is now. And the author emphasized now. So, this is an appeal. This is a very specific new left kind of calling. It is we can see that there is a call for an appeal to anyone, meaning a traditional leftist call, so So behind ethnicity, religiosity, it's not a call for Romanians to act, it's not a call for Germans to act. It is the time for the world to act, yeah? For the whole world. And it is now. This emergency of the call emphasizes the activist dimension of the movement. And translate this urgency of the call. And as I already mentioned, this boycott, divestment, and sanctions will always be seen in the campus. And always after this, this mask of anti-Israel campaign. Okay, it is for me. It is very important to following this topic. It was very important to understand the climate and what is representative of this kind, and to see the pattern, because there are a lot of anti-Semitic incidents on campus, which are started to be monitored start with 1984, when there were 4 incidents, and in 1995 there were 180 and something, and in 2005 there are 1,700 and something. Okay, it is clear that it is an increase, but what the numbers means, what do they mean indeed, and if I'm telling you, we can put in this way, that even if there is only one anti-Semitic incident, there is too much, and there is a precedent, and there is an emergency to act. But if we are talking of, if I'm telling you that it was a decrease with 3% from 1994 till 1995, you cannot appreciate if it is much or what does it mean. So because of this, I was trying to follow a pattern, yeah, of what this anti-Israeli campaigns means, and to understand the climate, what makes them possible, and to understand also what can be done to react to this. Usually this Anti-Defamation League, and there are other research institutes which works exclusively to see to analyze this content of anti-Israeli campaign. And yeah, so there is a very descriptive, we have these very descriptive documents. We have them. Trying to see this pattern, what this pattern is about, and trying to find it in this descriptive examples of anti-Semitic incidents on campus. I'll make an analogy to understand how I see all this story. So I'm saying like the Matryoshka story, which is the little stories which seems so similar, and there are different levels of understanding. So the Jew, who is equalized with the Chinese, with Israeli, with the colonizer, we can see now, with the capitalist, it depends on the story. But otherwise, in the context, he will always have the same meaning. And it depends also on the levels of understanding. If there is an anti-global movement, or if it is an anti-American movement, or an anti-communist movement, the Jew will be called differently. It will always be anti-Israel campaign to be legitimized, the action. And yeah, this is the vision, like to understand the pattern, which will repeat it. And what is very interesting is that at the level of campus, we can follow the same stories, and they are not more refined than in other places. I was, because I knew that so I was familiar with this attempt of trying to gain legitimacy through an Israeli campaign to a political statement in academic environment. I was expecting to meet in these descriptive examples of anti-Semitic incidents, I was expecting to meet more anti-Israeli statements and civic positions. But in fact, there are even the most known anti-Semitic incidents, let's say not a swastika in a corner of a campus, yeah? Which can be marginal and can be a case study. But there are very many, like Hitler didn't finish his job, Jews are pigs, and forms of Holocaust denial. And this was, and Zionism is racism. So many forms of violence, and this type of violence and also this type of language is not more refined or more hidden or more subtle in this university environment, and as I was expecting. So this type of violence is the same as on the street. Because of this, I entitled my paper New Avenues on Campus Antisemitism, to see that the same avenue, that same street we can see also in the campus. In other words, my thesis here is that the face of campus has changed. And I will use, this is I will talk about to make you understand that my point that the violence and the material is not specific for an academic environment, so at least not anymore. The kind of discourse which is used. And so I think that the face of campus has changed, and this is after the student movements of 1968, and these structural changes in the university environment we have to address this kind of topic and to understand the climate. And the campus, I would say that it's not imagined anymore like that idyllic environment which make us think to some olive trees, that Greek image, yeah, of academia, and the students working with the maestro and listening their maestro. It is an avenue of marching, of protesting, of taking position, of acting in this Marxist code of the time is now to act, and the time is now to change the world. It's not time for philosophy, it's not time for academia, for learning, for studying, for an in-depth perspective, because everyone is equal. Yeah, the professor is student, and everyone can have a position. So there is a kind of radicalization, and the kind of because of this activism. And I know the text to see and to appreciate or to weigh this kind of radicalization. I was using a litmus test, I would call. There is this litmus test that is used in chemistry. For sure, now you use a substance to see if something is basic or acid. Yeah? So the litmus test, I would say, for this radicalization is antisemitism. For a society or for campus environment, in this case, you can address this issue of antisemitism to see if how will the campus react, or how university environment will react. So there are very representative. There is a very representative saying in the University of California, Berkeley, and it is very representative for the 1964 generation, that there is a soil of 6 inches of dirt, and that space and the space above and the air above should not be reclaimed by any nation, and should be anyone who is staying there and express their voice and make their voice to be heard should be claim immunity from the seal or prosecution. So this is the absolute freedom. So in this new left, which is a very agreeable idea, and anyone would credit, you can see this dimension of radicalization. And it was meant to be a monument to free speech movement. It is, of course, it is a matter of imaginary and a matter of discourse. It is a folklore. And but on this idea of radicalization of the university environment, there are some people like Gary Tobin, or who talk about putting this, what I said, litmus test, or studying antisemitism in this university environment. He concluded that there is not anymore a civil university. And this was, to be very, very short, to give you an insight, it was what it was talking here at the beginning of the seminar. The people were talking about that student that addressed that question, that stakeholders of the university should take position when it is a matter of antisemitism, not only the Jewish organizations. So he concluded that nobody is taking position. There are used governmental funds, and there are many, and this is his conclusion, that there is an uncivil university. And there were also the study for Russell A. Berman, who are focused more on these structural changes of university and what this new left environment means. Application. Of course, we don't have to agree fully or to. I'm taking like a starting point, a way of understanding these 60s. And this matter of both of them, Gary A. Tobin and Russell A. Berman, were concerned about this free speech. And everyone said that under this free speech or this academic speech, no one can, also in the audit of Anti-Defamation League, the people said that they cannot have opposition against this anti-Semitism campaigns or these incidents in campus because there is this free speech or this academic free speech. Because somebody said that we have to understand that it is not campus anymore a comfortable environment for the Jewish students, but the campus do not supposed to offer a comfortable environment for the Jewish students because the Jewish students have to be opposed with not with necessarily with similar views. So because under these things of free speech or academic free speech, people do not take position or do not think that they should take position. And not because even if at the end concluding violence, they, in their opinion, it is more important to defend free speech and academic free speech than to restrain the free speech to end this problem, which is very specific and it is concerning only the Jewish organizations. From another point of view, I would say that if we have a look on some studies or some positions of the new left, all the anti-Israeli campaigns looks very good, and they are a statement for a better world. They are fighting for human rights, but always we can see that there is a mirroring argument in a response to this anti-Israeli campaign, and this mirroring arguments, I think that we really should address this specific concept of mirroring arguments because this specific thing to overlap the same celebrations or the same days who matter for the other. With this about very succinctly, I would say that why I would say that there is this radicalization in this on this campus, and you don't necessarily need a special tool to address them because when you analyze this all these campaigns or everything what is going on, you have to this travested anti-Semitism in anti-Zionism and Israel anti-apartheid apartheid movement or everything. You have a look on flyers, on pamphlets, on posters, on rally announcements, on petitions, on internet, and all of this emphasize this activist position, and there is by corollary the type of violence. So on this activism, we have, of course, hooliganism, we have physical threats for the Jewish students who are identified as Jewish. If you are wearing a t-shirt or because this is also very interesting because a lot of Jewish people address this concern of they do not feel, not that they do not feel comfortable, but they feel fear and they cannot wear anything that can identify them as a. And there are these, as happened at Arvin or at Berkeley, when there is a Holocaust Memorial Day, it was concluded in violence, and it means that necessarily police have to intervene, and because of these physical threats. And there are some specific, you can see some specific themes on this anti-Semitic campus incidents. One of them very spread most that I was expected was that of Holocaust denial, and Holocaust denial. Another specific concern, it is this of what is going on in Middle East department. Everyone is having an eye on this. There is also a very well-known movie on Colombia Unbecoming, and there are interviews with people from Middle East departments who want to stay for this idea that there are biased Muslims who by default have a propaganda anti-Israel, and these are really a specific concern because they do not allow any Jewish or pro-Israel campaign. And what was quite addressed this topic here about the third world revolution, the fact that we do not have any more objective truth. So it started that all these minorities to represent themselves, and even if they are biased, this is welcomed in the academic speech. And the fact that you have a protest or have a political or civic position, this is welcome. It's no one tried to achieve an objectivity or something else. So because of this, there are I don't know how correct it would be or helpful to address this. There are these Muslims who are engaged in this Middle Eastern studies, and they promote this idea and a way of radicalism, what is translated as Gary taught in university. This Holocaust denial also comes as I would say that is very specific for New Left movement who universalize this genocide, concept of genocide, and it is very similar to the phenomenon as in Central and Eastern Europe when it was a state-organized forgetting of the Holocaust, and even now it is very relativized and compared with other genocides, and in this way it is a matter of past, and we have to be concerned of some matter of present, and in this way we address this Israel issue. And there is also with Middle East, this is minus about this apartheid and anti-apartheid, and here it goes hand in hand with these Middle Eastern departments. There is the same image of the Israel propagated as colonizer and as the white, and opposite to in a position with the Palestinian or the weakest, who is the brown and who is the indigenous. And this is the last image of the colonizer who is having an impact because of already constructed discourse. And we address now to a decolonized leader. This is very important. Our leader is not anymore one who can think differently because of. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll make some time. We have 20 odd minutes for questions, and then Annette, and then.
Yeah, I have just a thought that came to my mind and a question for you, Cosmina. Firstly, I just in your last sentences, I remembered that maybe if you want to go further with this, maybe you should look at Hannah Arendt's Nonviolence, because it hit me. She so problematized this in the 60s, sort of in a very similar way as you did, the campus and diversity and the problems with it, and it is very interesting, and the way she did it, but also problematic, I think, at some points. But this link, for me, it linked very much to what you said. So, and what I was interested in, if you could say a little bit more what you meant with the mirroring.
The mirroring.
What
Mirroring
was
is, for example, when it is Israel is accused then that it is a Nazi. Yeah, they're mirroring another argument that. If there is an anti-Israeli campaign, they will say that Zionism is equalized with Nazism, or Israel is equalized with Nazism. When it is a contra-argument, somebody is trying to countering this, will say that no, the other is the Nazi. Yeah, and always you use, if it is said that Israel is not respecting the human rights, they are using now the Palestinians are not respecting the human rights. So it's always a mirror, and we need the third way. This is not I think that it is not a way. And what is the problem here is the problem that you can, even in this Anti-Defamation League, and there are a lot of things who are monitoring what, when they have to sort out some, to find some way of sorting out the problems, they are trying to raise concern in the Jewish organizations. But you have to translate, to find a third way, and not to translate it as a Jewish organization, or to make aware the Jewish students how to react when they are, because you're not uprooting the problem. You're just educating people that there is a problem. You know, but there is no, and this mirroring of arguments, you are still, there is a problem, and but you're not uprooting the problem.
I think Josh also wanted to speak to the issue of mirroring.
Thank you. I've also seen this, noticed this a lot lately, looking at criticism of Israel and discourse or claims about anti-Semitism, that they often seem to mirror each other. And I mean, just to take an example from Cosmina's presentation, which was a quote apparently from the BDS movement, which I also went to some of these events for the BDS movement and was very struck by the extreme nature of the discourse. So you quoted, you said they were saying it's time for the whole world, the time is now to act. There's an emergency call. The time for BDS is now.
No, for the world, it's time. For the world, it's time to react. It's not for the BDS.
But didn't you start by saying the time for BDS is now?
The time for world to fully adopt is firstly an appeal. The time for the world to fully adopt and implement the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and section is now.
Yeah, that's what I said. BDS, boycott, divestment,
Yes.
is now. Yeah. Anyway.
No, that is the complement. We have.
I think we're saying the same
No,
thing.
it is the time. It is the time. It's more like it is raining. The time to do this. So it is the direct action. It's very important, like in grammatical way, you know. It's verb, you have the verb, and you have the complement.
Yeah, I think I got it. I think that's what I was
It's not
saying.
the PDS subject. The subject are we. You know, that tricky subject like in 1964 that...
Yeah, I understand. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is it's this sense of urgency, the call for emergency, call for action. The call is for us to action. So two things here, just to point it out. Our morning started with the call to action and an emergency. And this is not to say there may well be an emergency. There are instances in which there are emergencies. But when we invoke this, I just think we have to be careful about it because there's so often, and I think at least I worry about this language of emergency because it's so often used to justify other things that I'm uncomfortable with. So, for example, the use of the idea of emergency is in human rights law the key way that rights can be limited or suspended. It's the key way that constitutions can be limited or suspended in many countries around the world. A lot has been done in the name of emergencies, and some of these emergencies have been, more obviously emergencies than others. So,
but I think the problem is that you're reading Giorgio Agamben and not listening to Cosmina. Because what you have been said right now is, I'm quoting it in my YIISA working paper, is Giorgio Agamben. Giorgio Agamben, one of the most quoted philosophers of the 21st century, maybe even more ugly than Heidegger, Agamben is saying what George W. Bush was doing after 9/11 is even worse than the Nazis did to the Jews.
I'm not saying that.
No, but you're saying that.
I'm saying both.
Okay.
What I'm saying is
Hold on,
both.
Josh, you responded.
Yeah.
I just think, urgency. if we look at the situation for Israel and Jews, and if we look at the increase of the dangers since the Second Intifada, and many more since talking about 1948, I make the claim that Islamic Jihad is an ongoing war since a long time, which does not mean that every Muslim is a terrorist, of course, but all terrorists of today are almost Muslims, so there's to think about this, and Israel is obviously in an existential threat. I mean, Yossi Halevi yesterday, he was really very serious. I mean, and several other of our speakers, or Christy and others, Shateley, were really scared. And that is definitely a point to have kind of
Okay, I don't want to get, Ben, you had a question?
Yeah.
Benny.
You didn't
Okay,
just-
he'll come.
Yeah, I have,
You had a question?
right, let me just, group here, I think I have 3 quick questions.
3.
One page.
For Clemens and Josh, and perhaps Cosmina can also interject because it spills over onto her topic. I guess, Josh, I hope I understood you correctly, but you had mentioned that there were also examples where anti-Semitism is being used as a smokescreen or as a way to sidetrack. No?
I was saying that people are suggesting that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I would just be curious to hear what some of those, because I'm divorced from the American discourse, some of those examples they mentioned where those folks are suggesting it's being used as anti-Semitism as a way to sidetrack discussions about Israel and human rights. And then in terms of your talk, you had mentioned, I believe, Judith Butler,
Yeah.
her essay. Just to segue into what Yossi said last night about Jewish anti-Zionism, Butler is enormously popular in Europe. She just spoke in Berlin. As a student, studying gender, I also delved into her works. But it's interesting that she's crystal clear when she writes about Israel, and just impossible to read when she writes about other topics. But in terms of her crystal clear writings about Israel, it seems, I don't know if she's reached the point right now, like Naomi Klein, where she's advocating a boycott. But these types of figures, Naomi Klein's Canadian Jew, I think the daughter of Holocaust survivors, Charles, I think she's a daughter, I'm not sure. Is this being, in your field, is this being researched, the role of Jews in terms of contributing to this fiercely anti-Israeli discourse? And as reference point, I'm using Albert Roosevelt's essay, which sort of caused this huge controversy a couple of years ago. How that's playing out in terms of those positions. Naomi Klein, Judith Butler, also grew up as a Zionist Jew in Cincinnati, or no, in Ohio, in Cleveland. Is that being used as a prop to further this discourse? Because in Europe, as I mentioned last night, it's mushroomed. And I'd like to hear more about what's happening in the States, but also if you know anything about Finkelstein. Sorry.
Finkelstein in Europe.
Yeah, but Finkelstein, I think, has been discredited, whereas the others are still seem to me maybe not.
In the UK, it's very popular.
Okay. But in the States, Butler, and in North America, Naomi Klein is now the darling of the left and the progressive forces. Then, and also Richard Falk, I would add too. I'd like to hear because he's also, playing a role. Also, 2 of the 3 people I've mentioned, I think, are contributing editors to the Nation, and folks on the panel can answer that too if you're curious. The statements that they're making, could they, following the European Union working definition of anti-Semitism,